So I have the honor and the almost impossible task of wrapping up this 2 days because it is clear from the report backs we've heard just this morning that there have been very rich discussions here. There's a lot to talk about and a lot of energy in those discussions in trying to figure out how we crack these challenges. So let me just say a few things by way of closing. The first, to start with the obvious, is that zero is tough. Right? This is a very hard problem that we're trying to tackle, and I'm sure that you felt that in each of the breakout sessions and maybe in some of the sessions here. This is a time when governments are struggling because, of course, they're consumed with the challenges of economic recession in the industrialized world and the challenges of sustaining growth in the emerging economies. And because, as we've just talked about, they face such fierce resistance from those who are the incumbents of the high-carbon economy. Secondly, even if governments weren't struggling with other problems, this is a very complex challenge that we face. This is the challenge of transforming an economy which over more than a century has been built without any carbon constraint, and frankly with relatively few resource constraints. So it's an economy that is not at all suited to dealing with the challenges that we are now trying to address. As a result, there is a lot of inertia in the system. And that inertia can be political, it can be infrastructure, it can be regulatory standards that favor existing technology and not new technologies. So I just want to say up front, let's recognize this is really hard. Let's also please recognize it is super urgent. We were saying urgent about climate change 15 or 20 years ago. We all felt that urgency in the lead up to Copenhagen. And I think we all know, but it's easy to forget, that in fact the urgency has increased since then, because it is the unfortunate nature of this problem that the longer you wait, the harder it gets to solve it. Because the more of your carbon budget you've used up, the less you have left to make it through the transition. And of course, in the meantime, the more emissions you've locked in by continuing to build power plants and cities and highways and so forth. So I just want to emphasize that because, especially over the last couple of years, with all the efforts to discredit climate science, with leading, apparently, politicians in some prominent countries even doubting climate science, it's easy to forget that, in fact, it's urgent, that the future of the world really does depend on cracking this challenge and that time is very short. Now, facing that, there is, of course, and we've all recognized it, an obvious solution, which is a multilateral global response. And that's important for all sorts of reasons. I mean, we need to have agreement on what we are collectively going to do to meet what is the mother of all market failures. We need to be able to translate that into national obligations and commitments, ideally into price, ideally and certainly into global financial mechanisms. So there's no question that that's essential, and we've been right to push for it for so long. There's also no question that it's just not happening as fast as it needs to. So while we push on that, we need to find ways for governments and companies to act. And that's what these discussions have been about and why they're so important. As we've just talked about in the last panel, that's partly about, for governments, that's partly about finding ways to move the incumbents, and we do need to do that. We do need to find pathways for, in energy-intensive industries, to get onto a low-carbon trajectory. But as I said a few minutes ago, at least as important is creating the market leaders of the future, the new energy majors, because they will be the drivers of growth, they will be the drivers of job creation in the decades to come. There are many, many aspects to that challenge. There are many things that governments should be doing, but to draw on these discussions, let me just highlight three. One is, you have to have, as I think Peter was saying in part, you have to have a national framework that is committing to action on climate, that is setting clear targets and is mapping out the pathway. You have to have coherent national policy. And that sounds difficult and is at the moment impossible in some important places. But you see Scotland yesterday committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2020, which is very soon. You see the UK committed to 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2025 and more than 80% by 2050. There are countries moving to create those national frameworks, and that's one important government's response. A second, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is a concerted strategy to drive the key technologies into the marketplace. We've seen how that can work in Denmark and China and Germany and other places. We know that we need to do that in a comprehensive way. And the fact is that there are so many market failures on so many fronts that we can't just rely on correcting the failures. We have to proactively identify the technologies that show promise and find ways to really make them happen, to drive them down the learning curve to cost competitiveness. We need to generate public dollars, and we need to find a way to do that that's not hostage to the austerity plans of the moment. Bunker fuels that I mentioned before are one idea, but there are others. But clearly, especially if we are to meet the needs of the most vulnerable countries, if we are to find a path for developing countries to grow their economies while protecting the climate, we need to find the public international resources to invest in those goals. Now, this conference, of course, stands out partly, well, mostly, for its focus on business and the role that business can play in this equation. And there, let me just say a couple of things. One is, I think, an important thing to recognize here is that business needs to remove its blinders about what's happening in the world and what it means for business. The carbon bubble concept, which we've talked about a little bit over these 2 days, is one good example. If, in fact, we're currently valuing companies and stock exchanges and economies on the basis of carbon assets, which will be largely unusable, then that's something we need to begin to internalize in the way we make economic decisions. McKinsey and others have showed us that there are huge gains to be had there. The $100 bills to be picked up off the shop floor by just paying attention to how you can save carbon in your business. And there is a dawning recognition in some parts of the private sector, but I think it could go much more broadly, that resource scarcity is already a reality, that resource scarcity will wreak havoc with your business unless you begin to act to make it more resilient to a carbon-constrained economy, but to an economy that's constrained in other ways. So partly for the private sector, this is removing those blinders and beginning to think in a changing world about what those changes mean for your business. A second opportunity here that I want to highlight is the potential for collective action by business. Business is instinctively competitive, and that's generally a good thing. But we are increasingly seeing companies recognizing that some of these issues are pre-competitive issues, and that there is power in joining together to crack them. We talked briefly in the last session about recent moves towards moving global commodity markets to sustainability. And the Consumer Goods Forum initiative that was alluded to earlier this morning is one example. You have 19 of the world's largest consumer goods companies. This is Unilever and Coca-Cola and Walmart and Tesco, big companies who are saying, we'll commit ourselves to eliminating deforestation from our supply chains by 2020. And we're going to do that by shifting all of our sourcing to certified sustainable supplies of soy, of palm oil, of beef, timber. Now, there's a lot of work to turn that pledge into reality, but it is a recognition by those companies that for a suite of business reasons, they need to act on this issue, and that there is power in acting collectively, because together they can actually help move the whole market in the direction they need for their business and all of us need for our survival. So there is a lot that can be done here, even as we struggle with some of the policy challenges. So in closing, let me just say a couple of things. This is, in the end, about something that has come to be called the green economy. In June, I chaired a debate at the United Nations General Assembly on the green economy, and the first half of the debate was entirely as the ambassador described, which was the expression of concern that the notion of a green economy could become some kind of limitation on our commitment to sustainable developments, could become a conditionality on trade, could otherwise interfere, in fact, with the development prospects of developing countries. And that cannot be its purpose or its effect. But I think we can agree, even as we use the term green economy, that we all have an interest in finding a way to build a shared prosperity that the Earth can in fact sustain. And that's what this is all about. And that's what the debate in Rio needs to be about. And as our colleague from OECD said earlier this morning, this is not a luxury. This is the only path to economic prosperity. So we need to figure out how to recognize that, and how to recognize that the future, in fact, belongs to those who take the lead. Thank you.